Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are in the world. We're going to be talking about a low-fat diet today. There's so much more heat than light about diet, meaning a lot of emotion, not nearly so much cold, hard facts. And yep, people love to beat up on whatever's not their favorite diet. Over the past 5 years or so, a lot more information, a lot more evidence has started coming out about diets. And we're going to talk about one of them today. It was a meta analysis. For those of you that don't remember, a meta analysis means that they look at multiple studies, study after study, on a specific question. So it's not just one study, it's a study of studies. So we'll get to that a little bit later in the content section today. Low-fat diet versus others. The specific one being versus low carb. So for those of you who have not joined the channel before, we're all about helping people avoid the most common causes of death and disability. And that's heart attack, stroke, most common cause of blindness, most common cause of kidney disease, all boils down to one thing more than anything else: cardiovascular inflammation associated with prediabetes and diabetes. Now, there's a lot that goes into that. For example, we recently covered coronary artery calcification, a very interesting and big topic. 2 years ago, the American Heart Association said, look, if you have a 0 calcium score, you don't have to take statins. You don't have to worry about a heart attack. Well, those of us who understand plaque and actually look at things like IMT have often wondered, is that really the case? Is it really true? And there's now a study out that shows, not so fast. You should actually think about it twice before you think that I've got no risk with a 0 calcium score. Another one, is overeating really the cause of obesity? That's sort of related to the issue today. There is nothing more important than lifestyle, and there's no component of lifestyle more important than how we eat. It is the major driver of our health. So again, a little bit more information. And again, overeating, if you're assuming that just eating too much is the issue, you should look again. It's often not what you think. And in fact, there's a couple of really good books. One of them by Gary Taubes, and he talks about why we get fat and what to do about it. That's the name of the book. And the reality is, he makes a really good point. We think that we get fat because we overeat. And his point is, maybe we start overeating because we're getting fat. And he makes a really good case for that. In fact, some of the best scientists in the world today in this space would agree with him. And it has to do with insulin, hormones, and what's going on with hormones in our body. So if you're interested in finding out about how to protect your health, we've got free or cheap content that can help you do that. Unfortunately, the evidence is pretty clear that 2/3 of docs don't understand insulin resistance, prediabetes, well enough to diagnose it, let alone manage it. So it's a buyer beware space. You have to be careful. You have to look out for yourself. And within just a couple of hours, the biggest expense is your time. And within just a couple of hours, you can know more than the vast majority of docs about the things that really kill or disable you. Not going to talk much about the Alabama Project today, other than sometimes I feel like the dog that caught the bus. It's really active, really going strong, and huge response. A lot of need down there. We have continued to get really good comments, really good feedback, and sales on the book. It's been a bestseller, international bestseller in all things heart related. Now, we've got so much content. We've started doing a short content and then a long content section. Then we follow that up with Q&A. Today, the short content has to do with cardiovascular complications of COVID-19. You know, we kept saying throughout the pandemic, except for one short time period, that more people were dying from prediabetes and diabetes, even during the pandemic, than were dying from COVID. And we actually went on to say, even during that short time period, a large portion of the people that were, quote, dying from COVID were actually dying from cardiovascular related diseases. And there were a couple of links to it. One of them being that if you had diabetes or prediabetes, you were much more susceptible to the cytokine storm and serious COVID. So let's look at this a slightly different way. Another version of it, the other direction. Does COVID actually cause cardiovascular disease? And the answer is a resounding yes. Does COVID cause diabetes? Yes. In fact, I've seen that happen with many of my patients who had moderate levels of prediabetes, and then after they developed their COVID, had a significant problem for a while. Then as they came back for follow-up, their retesting for prediabetes showed a significant increase. But let's talk about this one. This was in the British Medical Journal, February of this year, from Sweden, and it's cardiovascular complications of COVID-19. They're looking specifically at things like deep venous thrombosis, pulmonary embolus, and bleeding after COVID-19. So the study was over 1 million people that were tested positive for SARS-CoV-2 between February 2020 and May 2021. The statistical analysis was used to determine the incidence and risk ratio for deep venous thrombosis, pulmonary embolus, or a bleeding event. That's all we're talking about. We're not talking about increased diabetes right now. We're not talking about heart attacks or strokes, just deep venous thrombosis, pulmonary embolus, and bleeding events. There was increased incidence and risk ratio for first pulmonary embolus, resulting in or requiring ICU admission, first deep venous thrombosis, and bleeding. COVID-19 is a risk factor for these cardiovascular complications 70 to 110 days after infection. So again, a lot of folks say, well, this was overblown. No, it is. It's a bad bug. There's no question. So that has to do with our shorts for today. As soon as Gilbert gives us the water ball, we'll talk about low-fat diets and how they stack up. You know, those of you who follow the channel know that I'm a big low carb diet fan. I used to do focus more on low fat, a little bit of plant-based tendency. I still have plant-based tendency, although I've switched from low fat to low carb. And there are clear reasons for it. Some of it has to do with the ability to lose weight. But that's not the biggest issue. The biggest issue is because it's what works for your body if you become insulin resistant. Well, you say, well, that's a small amount of people, right? No, it's over half of us once we're age 30. You say it's only for older people, right? Well, if you define older as age 30 and above, yeah. And, you know, if you're in your teens and 20s, 30 is older, but I joined Medicare next month. I'm 65. So to me, 30 is very, very young. And by the time you get into your 60s, well over half of us have very significant insulin resistance, prediabetes. So that's a major focus for it. But let's go back. This study really didn't look at the metabolic components. It didn't look at cardiovascular inflammation. It didn't look at any of that. It just looked at weight loss. So what was the study? Where was it? It was in Lancet. Lancet's a well-known global journal in England. The British Medical Journal and Lancet are the two big journals in England. This was back in 2015. It was a few years ago. It was research done at Harvard. Walter Willett. Those of you who know the diet space probably have heard the name Walter Willett. He's been in a lot of stuff. You may know the name David Ludwig. David Ludwig is someone that I quote a lot. And as you see, both of these gentlemen, researchers, are co-authors in this article. Ludwig is a big low-carb guy. He's an endocrinologist. He and David Lustig, I compare a lot. Both of them are endocrinologists. David Lustig runs the obesity unit at UC San Francisco. He wrote Sugar, The Bitter Truth, White, what is it, Pure White and Addictive or something. He's written a lot of stuff about sugars and especially fructoses. David Ludwig has written books on low-carb diet as well. His book is kinder, gentler, and to me, far more effective. It's called Always Hungry. Both of them talk about the hormonal mechanisms of weight loss. So this was a systematic review, again, out of a research team at Harvard. The research was on the effectiveness of low-fat diets for weight loss. And it basically showed mixed results until recently. So they said, here, let's take a look. It was a systematic review, a meta-analysis. In other words, they looked at multiple studies, and we'll go a little bit deeper into what that means on the next slide. It summarized the evidence of randomized clinical trials or randomized controlled trials lasting a year or more, in which changes in low-fat diets versus other diets was compared. The authors included trials lasting a year or more, comparing the change of low-fat diet with any higher fat dietary intervention, for example, low carbs. The outcome of interest was long-term, 1 year or more, change in body weight. Like I said, nothing about cardiovascular inflammation, nothing about hemoglobin A1C, nothing about different bioindicators of autophagy, nothing about any of the bioindicators of longevity except one. But that one is a very powerful one, and that is BMI or body weight. Trials where one group included non-dietary weight loss were excluded. In other words, if you tried to do it through exercise, those were not included. The authors calculated the mean difference in body weight change from baseline in both groups. Here's the results. First of all, they looked at, how many trials did they look at? 53 randomized clinical trials. It included 68,128 adults. 20 of these trials included patients with chronic diseases. Interventions ranged from very low fat, they classified that as 10% fat or less, to moderate goals of 30% fat or less. And they measured this. One of the questions is, what do you mean by percent fat? Is that grams or calories? Percent calories. Again, the meta-analysis included 68,128 adults in these 53 randomized clinical trials. The mean weight loss or average weight loss was 2.71 kilograms. What is that? a little over 5 pounds, right? 7 pounds, something like that. For those of us in the pound world, the standard deviation, that's what SD stands for. The standard deviation was 2.8. The citations identified and screened. What does that mean? The total universe of studies. There were 3,517 studies that they looked at. Full text articles were assessed for eligibility, 338. So with the 3,517, they already ruled out 3,200 of them. It wasn't a randomized clinical trial. It didn't use dietary means, or for some other reason, they knocked it out of the study. Once they got to took that first cut, there were 333 randomized clinical trials or full articles left. Then they rejected another 280. Reasons for rejection. 17 of them were non-randomized. 44, there was less than a year follow-up. In 52, there was no low-fat diet comparison of interest. 13, multi-component interventions. In other words, you couldn't really tell what they did because they did so many different things. On 38 of the studies, they didn't even give you the weight outcome. So as you see, you get deeper and deeper, and there were plenty of reasons. There always are. When you do a meta-analysis, it just helps you understand how bad most studies are. You know, people talk about studies. They quote studies all the time, and then they don't realize most studies are really, really bad. And so this is not unusual for a good randomized, a good meta-analysis of studies to start with over 3,000 and end up with 53 really good randomized clinical trials, which are good, good science and include good clarity of the processes, and then good clarity of the outcomes. What were the results? And these are called Christmas tree plots over on the other side. I won't go into that. Or whisker plot is a better term for it. Here's the results. Low carb weight loss led to an average of 1.15 kilograms. In other words, a couple of kilograms, or about 50% greater long-term weight loss than low-fat weight loss interventions. Let me repeat that. Low-carb weight loss. This was looking at low-fat diets. How do low-fat diets do compared to others? And the reality was the low-fat diet did work, but the low-carb diet worked better. I said 50%. It was a little bit less than 50%. But again, they worked better. No differences were found when comparing low-fat diet versus higher fat interventions. Compared with groups only following their usual diet, both worked. The low-fat diet weight loss worked, and they led to 5.4, I think that meant pounds, not kilograms, better weight loss. So what does all this mean? Low-fat dietary interventions work. They don't work better than low-carb. Low-carb diet interventions do have a significant, modest but significant increase in weight loss. Now, again, this is talking about weight loss only. This is not talking about other health-related issues. I would also point out these studies did not differentiate between people who have insulin resistance and people who don't. I suspect that you would get a significantly better input from, or a better result from, people that have insulin resistance, because for most of us, that's why we're gaining weight anyway. Low-fat interventions were favored only in comparison with lesser intensity interventions. Weight loss findings in other studies and trials were shorter duration, or less than a year. So again, Low-fat diets do work. I know that. I used one for 30 years. I recommended them for 30-something years, and then I changed. So that's it for today's long content. And when Gilbert, when you give us the transition, we'll go into Q&A. So the first comment from West Side, Fort Worth West Side, and as most of you know, all the Q&A is not necessarily about today's content. Fort Worth West Side is actually talking about last week's content, coronary calcium score. Maybe off topic, but what exactly does a calcium score measure? Volume or density of calcium? If so, is it in micrometers or something else? I'm not going to deal with the micrometers. It's something else. But my response was, it's interesting. It's a good question. I'm not sure that I'm answering exactly what you're asking, but the bottom line is it's both. You're looking at the amount of calcium, whether it's in one area of the artery or density, or located in multiple areas of the artery. That's what gives you your calcium score. So, good question. Thank you so much for Fort Worth West Side. John Tocho, good morning, Dr. Brewer. A question about niacin. What's the trade-off of increasing HDL versus risk of impacting insulin sensitivity? It's a great question. You know, I keep meaning to bring that up. I currently use slow release at night. Thank you. So, for those of you who don't know, and I keep running into people who don't, insulin sensitivity is decreased. Insulin resistance is increased by niacin. It's also increased by something else that's very commonly used for cardiovascular health, and that is most statins. People don't think about that. They don't know that. Insulin resistance is increased by the treatment. In both cases, you know, in neither case, I wouldn't use niacin if I didn't need to. I wouldn't use statins if I didn't need to. And don't recommend that for others either. But there is a significant difference. The higher dose statins cause significant increase. Lower dose statins don't tend to cause as much. Same thing with niacin. But we do usually recommend higher doses of niacin. Another difference between niacin and the statins is that the niacin increase in insulin resistance is time limited. It tends to last about 6 months and then tends to decrease. With statins, it's not so much. Now, what's the answer with statins? Again, either A, use a low dose rosuvastatin, or use pitavastatin, which doesn't increase insulin resistance. So in both cases, you need to make sure that you've got an appropriate reason for taking these, like a significant decrease in HDL, or Lp(a), one of the more common reasons for taking that. I hope that helps. Thank you so much, John, for bringing up a good topic. Margaret D, good morning, Dr. Brewer. I'd like to hear your comments on pressure tests to determine arterial stiffness. I'm in a woman's heart study and score was 10.3. Now, what you're talking about, we covered in the book. Todd Eldridge does a good bit of what they call functional tests of arteries. They test for stiffness, they test for the reaction of the artery, and there is truth to it. The biggest issue, though, is that you need to make sure that somebody whoever's doing your testing really knows what they're doing, because you get a whole lot of these tests where they cut off a part of they cut off the circulation, or they squeeze the finger, they squeeze a part of the arm, and then they look at the reactivity of the artery. Significant garbage in, garbage out. So make sure that you've got somebody who knows what they're doing. And also make sure, even with the best testing, there are very significant limitations in what you can interpret from them. Bottom line is, I don't really use them that much. A couple of reasons for it. One is the vast majority of my activities are telemedicine. So I'm not there to supervise those when they happen. Margaret D., the measurement was taken with a special blood pressure cuff. They get concerned at 10. Yep. So again, I get concerned when people are when people are depending too much on that. And here's the other thing. By far and away, the biggest thing that I tend to find is significant risk associated with insulin resistance, and people don't know it. Until and unless, what I would suggest is that people simplify. If you haven't had an insulin survey, do that first. If you want to do the next thing, get a good CIMT. And then if you want to do the next thing, you can look at cholesterol testing, but you really need to make sure that you get the fractionation, because as Thomas Dayspring would say, the fractionation tells you more. I don't entirely agree with him, because that triglyceride over HDL tells you a lot as well. But if you already have the insulin survey, the triglyceride over HDL still tells you something, because it tells you what's going on metabolically on a functional day-by-day basis in your body. Vape King, so thank you so much for the, I guess that's a hello or something. Old Roscoe, Maggie and I walked our mile already. I got a cup of coffee ready and looking forward to this. Well, thank you, Old Roscoe, and I hope you got the point. For those of us, and that's most of us watching this channel, probably have some insulin resistance. I know the demographics of the channel. This channel is unlike most YouTube channels. Over half of us are 55 or older. And I can tell you, over half of us have insulin resistance. So if that's the case, be careful depending on a low-fat diet. A. Schultz, how come we have no studies on heart disease? Much? I don't get that. There are tons and tons and tons of studies. How is there no money for it? Medicine as a whole is just a freaking joke. Don't get it. Don't get it, A. Schultz. I mean, there's just so much research out there, and I hope you're not starting to troll. Jane Ling, hi, Doc. Firstly, thank you for everything you do. My husband is a clear LMHR. Now, if you don't know what LMHR means, I'll translate. Lean mass hyperresponder. Triglycerides over HDL, 0.34. So that's one thing you can tell already. This person has either they've got a healthy combination of their insulin or carb metabolism and their carb diet. Either they've got and they may have, both of them may be really good. You see some people that have insulin resistance, but they still have a good triglyceride over HDL. And that's because they manage their diet so well. You can also see it on the other side, especially with really young people who don't have an insulin resistance problem. They don't manage their diet that well, but they have really good insulin sensitivity. The combination of those two things, a good diet and a good metabolism, causes a significantly low triglyceride over HDL. For this person, then look at the LDL, 251. So we had Dave Feldman on with us a few months ago, and he and I talked. We got a little bit technical, a little bit geeky, and that's one of the critical things. You hear and see people that have these elevations of LDL, and their doctors go nuts. And in fact, I get these calls. I get it, one or two of these a month, where it's somebody that was aware of the channel, didn't watch it much, finally decided they wanted to try a low carb diet. went low carb, and all of a sudden their LDL just went out the roof. Their doctor went out the roof. They went crazy. The doctor said, "This diet's killing you. Look at your LDL, your cholesterol. It's skyrocketing. It's killing you." And and then I have to describe to them and explain what LMHR is, lean mass hyperresponder. Now, what does the science show out there? Unfortunately, the science is not showing a whole lot yet, because that is an area where I agree with A. Schultz. There's just not a lot of scientists, medical scientists, that much aware of what's going on. Dave Feldman is, there are others out there, and they are working on that science right now. But it is not, everything we see so far does not support significant danger or risk with LDL levels high in the scenario that Jane Ling is describing, the lean mass hyperresponder. If you have other questions about it, you can go to Dave Feldman's website, The Cholesterol Code. He goes a lot deeper into that, like we did when he came on board. Vape King, I've been cutting back on saturated fat to help my coronary artery disease, but I also eat low carb. Not keto, but low carb. Well, Vape King, it's a good point. My routine recommendation, I do have a lot of people that come to see me that are keto. That's not my out of the blocks recommendation for most folks. It's not what I do. What I do is low carb. Definitely less than 100 grams of carbs per day, usually less than 50. But what I recommend is this is not a diet. This is not 6 months. This is not a year. This is not 6 weeks. This is not to lose weight. This is a permanent change in the way you eat. So do something that you can change and maintain permanently. And the kinder, gentler diets tend to be the way to go for longevity. 100 grams of carbs per day or less. And that's also glycemic carbs. A lot of people don't understand the difference between between carbs and glycemic carbs. Broccoli, cauliflower, asparagus, all of those are full of carbs, but you can eat all of those you want. They're not glycemic. Glycemic means changes the glucose value in your blood. So be aware of that when you start considering a low carb diet. Brendan Lenane recently had a CIMT of some kind, and the result was no calcified plaque or soft plaque is visualized in part of the ECA and ICA, external carotid artery and internal carotid artery. The part of concerned me, just how realistic is this with a calcium score of 390? Well, what they didn't describe is your common carotid artery. And they also, or at least what you're not describing, there are two major components that they're not talking about. One is the common carotid artery, and one is the bulb. The other thing I would say, Brendan, is it does happen, and it's been recorded. About 2% of people have plaque in one artery, in the coronary arteries, but not the carotids, and vice versa. So I would agree with you. The biggest issue, by far, the most common thing I see is that the technique was not appropriate on the IMT. IMT suffers from a garbage in, garbage out. And most of those that come to me, that people bring to me, they got it from X-rays or us out in their community, were poor quality. Jane Ling, athletic, should he have a plaque 2 an Lp(a) test with his ApoB at 172? I get plaque 2, I get C-reactive protein, HSC reactive protein, I get MPO, and I get microalbumin creatinine ratio. Those are the 4 components of the inflammation panel. If you have questions about that, I've done several videos on cardiovascular inflammation and the inflammation panel. The other thing I do is I always get Lp(a), and I always get ApoB and ApoA1, and I always get the fractionation. And if you haven't had by far the most important test, I'll go back and repeat that, is an insulin survey. Now, you don't have to do a full-blown Kraft insulin survey. Those are great. What we could get from Quest was a little bit different version. It's their Quest OGTT using 75 grams. It's a 2-hour test. So the two differences between that and the Kraft insulin protocol are, number one, Kraft insulin uses 100 grams instead of 75. Number two, Kraft insulin survey does 4 hours rather than 2. We can actually get 4 hours for you, but their standard, the Quest standard, is 2 hours, and we get plenty of information from that. In both of those, we get fasting or basal insulin, as well as 1 and 2 hour insulins to go with the glucose values. That is by far the most important test. So yes, cardiovascular inflammation is important. ApoB is important. Fractionation is important, but none of them are as important as the insulin survey. OGTT, if you can't get an insulin survey. But if you can get an OGTT, just get an insulin test along with each of the other glucose tests. Margaret D, remember the like button. Thank you so much, Margaret. I appreciate that. So far, we've got 78 people watching, only 1 like button. So to the other 77, I'm sorry, maybe you could give us a little love. Thank you so much, Margaret, for the reminder. M-Ball, I overeat when I'm bored or not busy. M-Ball, I do too. You're not the only one. And guess what? Yes, hormones are a big issue. Insulin sensitivity, insulin resistance are big issues for weight gain. They're also big issues for diet. It's hard to say, but I don't think that's the biggest issue. I think the biggest issue is in our head. It's an addiction. It's the only addiction that I'm aware of where you can't go cold turkey. Think about that. A. Schultz, weight loss needs to be stopped as a marker for healthy diets. I don't agree with that either. I'm sorry. Margaret D, anyone else have an unfocused screen? Well, my screen's pretty well focused, Margaret. Thanks for asking. E.T., could you do some more vids on the importance of NO, nitric oxide, and perhaps any new information, data in kicking it up some? Thanks. We'll add that to the queue. The queue's a few months long, I will warn you, but thanks for asking, E.T. Check your video quality selection. Thank you, M. Ball. Kick it back up to 720. It is 720. My video's set to high quality video, more technical stuff. It's clear on my end too, Bart. And thank you, Bart. Last week, you were very helpful in terms of helping us move that. We had a troll on, and you were very supportive. I wanted to tell you thank you again for your appreciation and support. So I'm not sure where all the blurring's coming from. By the way, we did start a Rumble channel. They gave us a call. They sent us a few emails, and they said, look, we would be interested in having you add your channel to our area. And for the first couple of months, I ignored that. And then I started thinking about it, went back and looked, and I thought about a couple of things. Number one, Rumble tends to be, have some political leanings over towards the right. And, I thought about it. My family's in South Carolina. Our Alabama program's obviously in Alabama. It doesn't matter about your political leanings. I think all of us deserve good health information. But that wasn't what really tripped me into Rumble. What really tripped me into Rumble was the locals information, or the locals platform. And the Locals platform is a great way to start to do webinars. And we haven't done those yet. We've done a few webinars, but we've never really had the best a good software platform for doing it. So if you happen to have an interest in Rumble or Locals, go over and check us out. We just got the channel up the past couple of weeks. Gosh, I don't know. More technical stuff, and oh my gosh, we just had a big jump in comments. I'm gonna see what I can do to try to crank it up in terms of comment. Okay, Raymond Rogers, thank you, Raymond. Lately, my blood pressure is all over the place, from 120/84 and a heart rate of 73 to 155/115. That second one's not very good, and a heart rate of 95. What can cause such a fluctuation? Raymond, the first thing to look for after age, which you can't do anything about, is body weight. For most of us, even minimal increases in body weight can cause a problem, and therefore minimal decreases in body weight can create some solution. That's the first place to look. And again, it's sort of like insulin resistance. We're fighting an uphill battle as we age. Imbal, a third of a stone. I think you're talking about that weight thing a few minutes ago. Margaret D, thanks everyone. 720 is clear. Parker Reed, thank you so much. I think Parker has done some, he's provided a lot of support and information to the channel. I think Parker's done some technical work. I think you mentioned with some industries in China, some plants over there. If you're interested in providing super chat donation, that's how to do it. You see that up in the upper right-hand corner. Gilbert's showing you. And here's the thing. This information is being provided all over the world to, no matter what political background you have, it's being provided. And we get feedback every week, every month in our comment sections that, hey, doc, I took your tests. I got them locally. I didn't have prediabetes. I had full-blown diabetes. And guess what? My doctor had no clue. My doctor's been telling me from fasting glucose numbers that I'm fine. And you know what? I think this is going to save my life. I've cut my carbs. I've lost 20 pounds. Again, life-saving kind of information. And, $10 American may not sound like a whole lot, but it is. Thank you again, Parker. We've got staff in the Philippines, staff in Mexico, places where $10 goes a long way. And, we get a lot of compliments about the technical quality of our programs now. And I can assure you, the technical quality, the images, that's not me, that's Gilbert. Gilbert is a great graphics designer in the Philippines. The video editing, that's done by Aspen. Sam manages a lot of the basic internet information, patient care. So thank you again, Parker. I appreciate it. Brendan Lenane, most people would find a real keto, 80% fat diets very challenging. From what I see, few do real keto. I would agree, Brendan. Incidentally, there was a book called Pure, White, and Deadly by Jay Yudkin in 72, long ago. I think that was also the name of a book by Robert Lustig, and he was referring to sugar. I may be wrong. It may have been Yudkin's book originally. 1:1. Best statin to use, please. Well, it depends on what your issue is. I use one of two, the vast majority of the time. The first is low-dose rosuvastatin. It used to be called Crestor, brand name. It's now available generically. The second one is Livalo or pitavastatin. Pitavastatin is very expensive, but it has the advantage of not being documented as not impacting insulin resistance. Now, you would say, well, that's a major advantage. And yeah, it is somewhat, but it's not really that huge compared to the real facts, because low dose rosuvastatin, 5 milligrams or less, has minimal impact on insulin resistance, and it's dirt cheap. So I've gone back and forth between the two. I'm currently on low dose rosuvastatin. Shark Air, interesting name. My red blood cell count is low, 3.88 hemoglobin, 12.6 hematocrit, 36.7. Should I be concerned? How do I increase iron? Well, there's some simple ways of increasing iron, but the first thing I would look at, especially depending on your age, and if you're middle age or older, the first question is, what's making you lose iron? Children typically have low iron, often have low iron. Women of childbearing age, because of menstruation, typically have low iron. The rest of us tend not to have low iron. That is, all males and females beyond childbearing age. So the first rule is to assess the situation, and assessing the situation is going to require you to say, why is my red blood cell count 3.8, my hemoglobin 12.6, and my hematocrit less than 37? Why is that the case? Why have you lost iron? And one of the more common reasons is that you have some sort of GI bleeding. It could be inflammation in there. It could be a cancer. It could be any number of things. It could be ulcer. First of all, assess the situation. Find out why you have anemia. One True Moose, what's your opinion of ezetimibe? I don't use it very much. Again, I know I started to say a lot of folks use it. Actually, very few of the people coming to see me are already on it. There's some perceived decrease in cholesterol associated with it, that and the cholesterol binding drugs. And those are all really focused on cholesterol. I'm not quite so much focused on cholesterol as I am on insulin resistance. Parker Reed at Brenda Linane, Dr. Ludwig's Always Hungry book, referenced by Dr. Brewer, is not a hardcore keto. It's around 40% carbs. Yeah. 198, I think page 198, for example, page 198 has a recipe for beef, bean, and barley stew. Page 194 has steel cut oats. Parker Reed, thumbs up, folks. After all those 2 reminders, gosh, guys, how can you spend so much time watching this and not at least just give us a thumbs up? That'd be very helpful if you could. And thank you so much, Parker and Margaret, for reminding folks. 82 people watching. At this point, 88. Franklin Taylor, as a person who has had moderately advanced NASH, non-alcoholic hepatitis via biopsy, in other words, fatty liver, via biopsy, who tried both low-fat diet and low-carb diet when diagnosed, I can say low-carb diet, eating rapidly, reversed the problem. Very true. Big issue. Fatty liver, and people hear that about, well, it's got fat in it, right? Yeah, it does. The body makes fat in these high carb environments. That's how the body stores fat. And, we go back to the thing about triglyceride over HDL ratio. Why would I go back to that? Here's the thing. Triglycerides drop as triglycerides are fats. And the fats in your blood drop as your carbohydrates drop. Why is that? Because of insulin. Insulin does a couple of things, 3 things, in fact. It actually has an involvement with memory, which we won't get into. That's a side issue. It decreases blood glucose in a couple of ways. Number one, by moving the insulin receptors to pull glucose out of the blood. But number 2, and here's where I'm going with this. insulin stops fat burning. So if you've got an insulin resistance problem and your body's continuing to push insulin because your blood sugar's high, your insulin stays high, too high, high enough to cut off fat burning. So your triglycerides go up. So that is one of the reasons why triglyceride over HDL is a key bioindicator of insulin resistance. It's also, when you go back to Franklin Taylor's comments about fatty liver, it's also why you get fatty liver. Fatty liver is a metabolic syndrome, an insulin resistance syndrome, a diabetes-related syndrome. And guess what? Cirrhosis of the liver is now more commonly associated with this problem than with alcohol. ET himself, thumbs up. Thank you, ET. Well, we've gotten 2 after all of that. Marwan Sal. Hi, Doc. You mentioned that one of your followers decreased his calcium score by going low carb. How can you explain dissolution of hard deposited calcium in arteries in a few months by going low carb? I can't. I don't know what happened, but I do know that it happened. You know, it's easier to explain my own decrease in volume, IMT. With IMT, we know that there's still some soft plaque in there. And we know that with soft plaque, you've got inflammatory cells, you've got fluids, you've got things like that. And so you can always decrease that as you decrease inflammation. You're not so much pulling LDL out of plaque or cholesterol out of the plaque as you're pulling the liquid out of the plaque, the inflammatory cells, and that will decrease IMT. But to your point, how did you pull calcium out of the plaque? And again, the answer is, I don't know. I do know that, the couple of guys that demonstrated that, John and Jerry, both had significant weight loss, significant loss of body fat, significant improvement of triglyceride over HDL, significant improvement of their insulin survey results, significant improvement of every bioindicator, and they decreased their calcium score. What do you think? So Anton Johnson, hello, Doc. Thanks for your earlier videos. I've been on citrulline and arginine for 2 years. You know, the citrulline and arginine videos are just very popular. You know, one of the reasons is they're a big deal for the weightlifting community. People feel like they get a vasodilation, a pump in the arteries, in their muscles from this. And they also think about it for erectile dysfunction and other things as well. Margaret D. Regarding my arterial pressure testing, it was one of many tests for a university in Manitoba. Women's heart study, warm heart study. It was the only number of concern. Well, Margaret, again, I hope you got an insulin survey or at least a GTT. And unfortunately, so many of these large studies still are not doing it. ET himself, results, don't know, understand the question, ET. Anton Johnson, which foods are carbohydrates? Well, there must be something to that question that I'm missing. Grain products are by far the biggest load of carbohydrates. Rices, pastas, breads, pizzas. You know, people say, oh, okay, I've got a little bit of insulin resistance. I'm going to decrease the sugar in my coffee. The sugar in your coffee, and in fact, sugar overall, tends to not be a huge source of carbs. Now, sugar in giant Coca-Colas, sodas, Dr. Pepper, et cetera, you name it. Those are major sources of sugar, no question. But outside of that, I mean, sugars in desserts, sugars in coffee tend to not be nearly as big a source as grain products like oatmeal, which is supposed to be, you know, I have so many patients tell me, Doc, you can't tell me that oatmeal is not good for me. Okay, I'll accept maybe I shouldn't be eating cereal for breakfast, but oatmeal? And my answer is, Okay, you know what? Eat to the glucometer. Get a finger stick test, or better yet, get a Freestyle Libre or a Dexcom 6. Look at your blood sugar on a regular basis. Eat these foods that you have questions about and see what it does to your blood sugar. And guess what, Anton? You can eat all of the cauliflower, Brussels sprouts, asparagus, all of those that you want. And yes, even though they're, quote, carbohydrates by the FDA regulations, they're not going to impact your blood sugar because they're not glycemic carbs. Thank you, Anton. I hope that answered your question. Amando Moreno in the Revival, would 40 milligrams rosuvastatin, I think is what you're looking for, be considered low? No, that's a very high dose. And I don't use that high a dose. You know, that's getting in. I use 5 milligrams or less of rosuvastatin per day. And in fact, I have a lot of people that are on 2.5 milligrams every other day, because we're looking more at cardiovascular inflammation. We're not looking quite so much to impact LDL values. And in fact, most of our folks get lower LDL values anyway because they are dealing with their lifestyle. They're dealing with their body fat components, and they're dealing with their diet. They're dealing with exercise. That automatically is starting to improve their unhealthy LDL components and HDL components. Meanwhile, what we're really focused on is cardiovascular inflammation, and Lipitor is not a great one for that if you're female, which is half of us, or pre-diabetic, which is far more than half of us. Rosuvastatin does a great job in this space, and it doesn't have to be 40 milligrams. It doesn't even have to be 10 milligrams, 5 milligrams or less, and it doesn't have to be every day. James Cantor, good to hear from you, James. Just letting you know that I did a calcium artery score a week ago. Agatston score was 0. James, that is so interesting because you have shared that you're diabetic, unless I'm mistaken. Normal heart size, no pericardial effusion, normal caliber thoracic aorta, and main pulmonary arteries. You know, James, for your perspective especially, I would be very interested in seeing the results of a good IMT, because you remember we covered that last week, the potential for someone to have nothing but soft plaque. Now, I know from what, James, for those of you who don't know James, he's a common supporter, common commenter on the channel. He's, again, shared that he has significant insulin resistance, if not diabetes. But he's also shared that he does a lot to manage his lifestyle. No significant atherosclerotic calcification of the left main, left anterior descending. That's what LAD means. And that's what most cardiologists or most docs most people would call the, quote, widowmaker. It's not because it is important, but it's also the most common area to have calcium. And the right coronary artery or circumflex. Thank you so much, James. That is very interesting. Appreciate you sharing that. M-Ball, is there any home insulin test? Unfortunately, not. That's the frustration. It would be, and there are people working on it. There's no question. The home testing for glucose has been a major, major improvement. You go all the way back to the days of, I'm blanking. Somebody help me. He's the father of glucose self-management. He's the doc up in, he lived over in New York. I lived in Larchmont, and he lived the next community over. And he was well known for having great glucose control. His wife was an ER doc when he was an engineer. This was in his 30s or 40s. He had type 1 diabetes. And she brought home this gizmo one day that the ER docs were using to measure blood pressure. He started using it for his own interest in health, ended up going to become a doctor, tried publishing information, and didn't get a lot of publication interest at first because he wasn't a doc. Went to medical school, and ended up becoming the father of diabetes self-care. Somebody remind me of his name. We talk about him a lot, and he's still active. He's in his 80s, or he was the last time I looked. The reason I brought that up is that was the access to home glucose finger sticks was a major revolution in health, prediabetes, diabetes care. Now, the Libre, affordable, Dexcom 6 is becoming affordable, much more affordable now too. But the Libre and Dexcom 6, those are slightly different. They're called CGM, continuous glucose monitoring. They are resulting in a revolution in health as well. We're finding so many more people have insulin resistance, prediabetes, diabetes than we ever knew. The next frontier is home insulin test, and we would love to get CIM, continuous insulin monitoring. And I can tell you there are companies working on that right now. James Cantor, duplex ultrasound of the bilateral internal carotid arteries demonstrated minimal to no plaque. 0 to 19% diameter reduction. Well, that is very, very interesting, James. Thank you so much for sharing that. Very interesting. So, you know, what James is describing, if I'm remembering your situation correctly, James, is sort of like me and my eyes. Most doctors would never have diagnosed me as having insulin resistance, let alone full-blown diabetes. But I did a couple of times document a blood glucose over 200. So you could technically say that I have diabetes. When I go to the ophthalmologist, the ophthalmologist found one drusen. That's singular for drusen. You just never hear it. And for those of you who don't know what a drusen is, that's the retinal, the back of the eyeball, the evidence of eye disease. So James may be demonstrating the same thing, that if you take good care of yourself, you don't get these the tissue damage associated with diabetes. So James, there's minimal to no plaque visualized in the bilateral carotid bulb. Thank you so much, James. Very, very interesting. Freedom Fighters 123, giving blood 2 to 3 times a year in men reduced heart attacks. Thought on this concept. First of all, I've heard that several times before. As I've looked at it, the evidence wasn't nearly as strong as you might have assumed. Now, like many things in research, you can say, well, it makes sense. There is some components that would say, well, it might make sense, especially for people that have a little bit too much iron. And men tend to lean that way. But again, go back and check the real evidence on that, Freedom Fighter 123. That one, I think, is one of the things that you see, like so many, where somebody had the logic, they went looking for it in the science, and they thought they found it. Nick's Repairs. Could you explain the importance of Lp(a)? So Lp(a) is LDL, except it's a genetic variation. And here's the thing about it. It's got a couple of differences on it. It's got one thing in it that's called a Kringle repeat. And it's like a little hook that's coming off of the protein. Now, for those of you who don't know, this gets into some of the science and some of the technology. You talk about cholesterol in the blood, and then you talk about good cholesterol and bad cholesterol. Good cholesterol is supposed to be HDL, bad cholesterol, quote, is supposed to be LDL. Well, the only difference, but the cholesterol is the same. The only difference between those two is the protein that forms the particle. Now, why would you have a protein forming a particle? Well, just imagine for a second. Okay, let's say we pour a bunch of body fat, and I've done this. let's say you're still a healthy eater. You eat a salad with a whole bunch of vinegar and oil. What's that oil going to do in your bloodstream? Same thing it would if you put it in water. It forms a bubble. An oil bubble in your bloodstream is just like a clot in your bloodstream. It'll cause strokes, heart attacks, major health problems. So the body forms these proteins that causes these oil bubbles to get brought down into tiny microscopic particles, and that's what HDL is. ApoA1, somebody mentioned ApoB a few minutes ago. ApoB is the protein used in LDL. ApoA1, which I mentioned, is the protein used to form the HDL particle. And guess what? The LDL version, genetic variation, which has these Kringle repeats hanging off, which is a part of a protein that's repeating, is Lp(a). Now, most people used to not even be aware of it. Even doctors weren't aware of it. I wasn't aware of it until I got way deeper into the cardiovascular prevention side of what I do. And the reason was, it was known to have risk, but nobody knew anything to do about it. Well, actually, you can take niacin, and niacin does decrease it. It decreases it by about a third, and some people think, well, that doesn't help. That's not true. I can tell you from watching cardiovascular inflammation, it does help. So still, it wasn't that well known until about 3 years ago when a fellow named Bob Harper had a heart attack. Bob Harper was the major physical trainer on The Biggest Loser. Young, in his early 50s, very little body fat, working out all the time, and he has a heart attack. Well, people go, oh, wait a minute. Well, what good is being young and working out all the time and having no body fat if you can have a heart attack? Within a week, he came out and he said, I have Lp(a). I got it from my mom. So Lp(a) made the prime time. Then the next thing that happened, well, actually, about the same time, there was an announcement that there's a new drug that actually impacts that. This drug is called antisense drugs. I'll make a quick comment. Those of you who were afraid of the quote genetics, the genetic alteration associated with the recent vaccines, maybe you should be afraid of the antisense drugs for Lp(a). All very similar types of mechanisms and activities, but those antisense drugs really decrease Lp(a) by a factor of like 90%. They're in clinical trials right now. The major decrease has been demonstrated. We're still waiting for data to come out to show that major decrease is also associated with decreased heart attacks. So, gosh, you know what? We've got a lot of comments. I'm going to try to move a little bit faster. I'm going to have to. Again, a lot of comments, a lot of questions. Gerard Webster, did you hear about the Pennsylvania Democrat gubernatorial candidate? John Fetterman just had a stroke. I did. Last Friday, AFib, pacemaker implanted yesterday, 52 years old. And his wife got up and said, thank you. I thought he was a senator candidate, not a gubernatorial candidate. And she got up and she said, if you haven't noticed, I'm not John. She did a great presentation, a great announcement. By the way, I can't help it. I was wondering if somebody was going to mention that primary. There was a recent comment that came out that said doctors are praying that Dr. Oz gets the nomination so he leaves medicine. No comment. Bart Robinson, thank you again for another great presentation. Thank you so much for your support, Bart. I appreciate it. Amanda Moreno in the Revival. Simple carbs are not complex carbs. Amanda, thank you for bringing that up. Take a look at it. Look up glycemic value. Look up glycemic value of sugar, glycemic value of white bread or simple carbs, and glycemic value of whole wheat bread. Got to be a complex carb, right? And in reality, even white bread is supposed to be a complex carb. Look at the glycemic value. Or better yet, why don't you just eat a sandwich with complex carbs, bread, or even whole wheat bread, and see what that does to your blood sugar. I have patients do this to me all the time. They say, Doc, you cannot tell me that oatmeal is not good for me. And I'll say, okay, I won't tell you that anymore. I'll just ask you to go ahead, eat some oatmeal, eat a white bread sandwich, eat pasta, eat some complex carbs, Armando, and then check your blood sugar. There's no need for me to have an argument with you about it. Just do it. LVC, best way to lower blood pressure, lose weight, if you can. T-Bone, video fine in Temple, Texas. Thank you, T-Bone. 1-1. Thank you for your insight and information. You're very welcome, 1-1. Thank you, LVC. Super imp, pitavastatin, no puzzle. Yeah, you know, the pitavastatin is a kinder, gentler one. And again, the low dose, I get very few people with any kind of, you know, people come to me, as you might imagine, people come to me that just don't want to take statins. I also, you know, one of the more common things I get is somebody saying, you know, Doc, I've watched your channel. I know you don't use them a lot. I know you don't use high dose. I've been refusing my doc who wants to put me on 40 milligrams of rosuvastatin or 80 milligrams of one of the other statins. If you look at my case and you think I need to, I'll bite the bullet and go ahead. That's sort of the way I felt. I put off taking statins for a couple of years when I knew that I needed them as well. So yeah, the lower doses, pitavastatin is all low dose anyway, even if you take 2 milligrams of pitavastatin or even 4. And the low dose Crestor, you tend to just see very, very few reactions to that. Oh, that's interesting. T-Bone, when you said 1 like, my screen showed 30. That's interesting. My screen only shows 2. Maybe, that is interesting. Thank you for the comment, T-Bone. Maybe we're not getting the same information. No trash in heaven. Oats or bread make me hungry in 2 hours. Is that insulin resistance? I think it is no trash in heaven. Thank you for bringing it up. So what happens with these carbs is you go on this insulin roller coaster and blood sugar roller coaster. And sure enough, take a look at it. Eat some carbs and get a CGM, Libre, continuous glucose monitoring, or just start monitoring your blood sugar and see what happens to your blood sugar. It goes up and down like a roller coaster, and you tend to get hungry when it goes down, and grumpy, and frantic. Fort Worth West Side, with eating low carb, low fat, force your body to burn more of your own fat. Exactly right. Versus low carb. So, you know, you hear this comment a lot. You look around on the internet and you hear people talk about, well, he's fat adapted. You want to get fat adapted. And that's exactly what happens. You know, your body uses proteins to solve to create solutions, to solve problems like the one we mentioned a few minutes ago with oil bubbles in your blood. It also forms proteins to burn fats or carbs. And guess what? If you've been living on carbs for a while, it'll burn carbs. It'll prefer to burn carbs. And so you have a whole different set of proteins that are involved in burning carbs. That's why it takes a while. It takes a few weeks to get fat adapted from a very carb-driven diet. And one of the things that happens, it's reality when you get fat adapted. One of the things that happens is people come to me all the time. They say, well, I dropped my carbs. I was gaining some weight. Saw your channel. I dropped my carbs. It became much easier to not eat. I became less hungry. And again, what's going on is they're getting off of that blood glucose roller coaster. And again, they talk about when you first go on low carb diet, you get the quote keto flu. That keto is headachy, feeling a little bit frantic sometimes and hungry. And that's because your body's not quite ready to burn fat. But once you get the carbs out, it's got nothing else to burn. It learns how to do it. Great question, Fort Worth. I appreciate you bringing it up. Tanner Bruin, my thumb counter is at 75. Mine's still at 2. That's so interesting. Well, thank you, Tanner, again. Thanks, guys, for making us aware. Boris in Kaya. I lost 60 pounds in 9 months following a low-carb diet, but my LDL went to 315. Sounds like a lean mass hyperresponder to me. Fractionation showed mostly small, dense LDL. That's not good. What would be something to consider differently? You know what? One of the questions I would have is, what is your HDL level? What is your triglyceride level? And I would also say this, Barris. Quite often people will say, oh, my small dense LDLs went way up. Not so fast. Be sure that you also look at your larger particles as well, because the labs, in most fractionation labs, they only show small dense. They don't show the larger, fluffier ones, because the small dense ones are the ones that are dangerous. Anytime your LDL goes up, all three, the small dense, the medium, and the large, are going to go up. So unfortunately, most people that have this elevation, especially somebody like you, where it tends to happen as a result of going low carb, they look at it and then they look next at small dense, and that went up. Of course, small dense went up, but did your actual pattern change? Did your bell curve change? Now, in those kind of fractionation patterns, one thing you can find, sometimes, used to, they would give me the actual fractionation pattern. Excuse me, they've stopped doing that anymore, but Quest will still give me the A pattern. If your LDL is an A pattern, it's not too much small dense LDL. It's still a good pattern. So not so fast. Be sure to be careful to know the details of what you're looking at. And most doctors don't know that, Boris. Great question. Thank you so much for bringing it up. I don't think we've discussed that on the channel yet. Candace, hey, what do you think about coffee? Does it increase blood sugar? Well, if you go to Starbucks, you get one of those. A lot of them increase blood sugar because they got a lot of sugar in them, but just routine regular coffee does not, and it doesn't increase it. And there's plenty of evidence to indicate it's not bad for you. It's probably good for you. No Trash in Heaven. Thank you so much. $20 super chat. I appreciate that. Again, it helps us get that content out to save lives across the world. T-Bone as well. Thank you so much to you. James Canner, you talked about Bernstein, Richard Bernstein. Thank you so much, James. That's who I was talking about. At age 80, Richard Bernstein had an HDL like in the 90s, just incredible. And, you know, that's unbelievable in the regular population to realize that he was a juvenile diabetic, brittle juvenile diabetic, and still has those kind of numbers in his 80s. It just shows how good his diabetes self-care was. Thank you so much, James. No Trash in Heaven. Dr. Bernstein. Yep. Lionelson. How low-fat body is way better than any low diet. Just don't get fat. Well, that's the whole point, Lionel, son. To keep fat out of your body, which is very dangerous, you got to keep carbs out of your diet, not fat out of your diet. That's not anachronism. That's not the right word. Anyhow, Jill Schwartz. Hi, Doc. Thanks for all you share on this channel. What are your thoughts on fruit? Can you eat it on a low-carb diet, or do you need to limit consumption? We do recommend that you, and I do this as well, I tend to limit. I eat a lot of strawberries, a lot of blackberries, some blueberries, and some raspberries. Don't eat bananas, don't eat mangoes, don't eat apples, and don't eat grapes. I don't recommend it because they have a lot of sugar in them. Lionel's son, don't get fat in the belly. Belly fat's a big problem. Michael Sanders, how are you, Michael? How important is uric acid in cardiovascular disease? High uric acid is a risk factor. And one of the things we usually ask when we see high levels is how much of a history of gout do you have? It's a moderate risk factor, not a huge one. Great to hear from you. Marwan Saul, for those who can't afford expensive medical tests, can you rely on BMI or more specifically, waist circumference to rule out cardiovascular disease? It is a big help and it is a huge indicator. But I've got myself and a whole bunch of other people who have significant insulin resistance, full-blown diabetes, who don't have much body fat. So yes, that's a very strong indicator, but it's not the only thing. How strong is the correlation between BMI and cardiovascular disease for different age groups? It is very strong. It's much stronger as you get older. Somnambulist, is that a sleepwalker? 4.49 pounds. I think that's the first time we've gotten a super chat in pounds. Thank you so much, Somnambulist. What are your thoughts on the mild carnivore? A lot of people hear that and they think, oh, you're crazy. And especially some of the docs that I know, David Wright and a couple of the other docs that trained in the Bale-Denine world, because Bale-Denine does not like saturated fats. They don't like high fat diets, et cetera, et cetera. I can tell you, I'm not as afraid of those. They tend to focus on Mediterranean diets. But again, my concern on a Mediterranean diet is it has a lot of grapes, a lot of grains, sources of carbs. And I'm more concerned about carbs long term. There was a great book, if you have a question about saturated fats, which is what the issue is with carnivore diet. The Big Fat Surprise by Nina Teichholz. You can say, well, she's not a doctor, she's not a science researcher, and both of those are true. She's a good science writer, though, and she's got a great set of stories on the science of saturated fat. That resulted in an increased level of attention to saturated fat, and actually there was a Journal of Journal of the American College of Cardiology. It was a article. It was last year. I covered it in a video, and just look up my videos, Ford Brewer, YouTube, or Rumble, low saturated fat. Use those keywords. You should be able to find it. There was a Jack. I'm having a senior moment. We just covered that kind of article today. Meta-analysis, where it looked at all the science out there. It was a really good article, really good study, and it showed no damage to health from saturated fat. So the science is really leaning against saying a carnivore diet is bad for you. In other ways, it's like the ultimate elimination diet. You're not going to get gluten or gliadins in a carnivore diet. The problem with, I've never tried that. I've had a couple of people on it, not very many, but again, I'm not as afraid of it as most docs. Janine Kalahar, why can't I find blood glucose sticks? I don't know. I mean, I find them everywhere. They're all over the place. Would they be helpful for a quick, cheap measure of blood sugar? Yes, they would. Bart Robinson, Richard Bernstein, thank you so much, Bart. Oh, gosh, here we go. A lot more comments. Yes, James Cantor, yes, I'm diabetic. Fasting blood sugar today, 114 on Ozempic, 0.5 milligrams per week, and metformin 500 per day. Thank you so much, James. What you're sharing with us is just not only informative, it's inspiring that, somebody like yourself can say, yeah, I'm a full-blown diabetic. Guess what? I don't have any plaque. Big, big, big deal. Jonathan Hull, Dr. Richard Burns. Thanks, guys. That's what happens. I have these senior moments. I can't remember something. And I get a lot of help from my friends. Shark Air, speaking of help from my friends, a $5 super chat. Thank you so much. Andrea, hi, Doc. Thanks for your videos. This community learns so much. Thank you so much. That's glad to hear it. Doug C, and we're rounding the backstretch. Total cholesterol is 218, HDL is 108, triglycerides 88. Yep. That sounds very much like the numbers of a lean mass hyperresponder. You see the triglyceride over HDL is less than 1. The total, oh, no, wait a minute. Total cholesterol. Well, the question is, what's your LDL level? They wanted me to have a calcium score done. Results were terrible, no symptoms. I would want you to have a OGTT with insulin survey. Perform stress tests, great results. That doesn't mean you're out of the woods. The doc said, I'm not clogged up. Plaque must be in between arterial walls. Be afraid, be very afraid, because what that means is your doc doesn't know that small amount of plaques. In fact, Doug C, be aware, 2/3 of heart attacks occur in people that would have or have had negative stress tests. You don't need the level of plaque to clog up your arteries to have a heart attack. That's not what you need. You just need to have a little bit of inflamed plaque. Mr. Jojo Samo, I hope I pronounced that correctly. Will consuming wild-caught salmon, sardines, or anchovies decrease triglyceride count? Again, yes, it can. You know, one of the treatments now for high triglycerides is specifically fish oils. And guess what? I eat not sardines. I eat a lot of salmon, a whole lot of salmon. And every day, like today, for breakfast, I had kippers, which are one of those fish oil, sardine-like fishes. Doug C, what would you recommend for a 60-year-old guy that eats Mediterranean diet, exercises 3 to 4 times a week, 6 foot, 210 pounds, 34-inch waist? First thing I'd recommend, I've said it before, I'll say it again. Make sure you get an OGTT with insulin resistant or insulin survey. Make sure you know what your insulin metabolism is. That is the major and first thing I'd recommend. Faisal Saeed, can we use Epler medicine for long-term? Ejection fraction of 40%. I don't know what Epler medicine is, Faisal. I'm sorry. Sorry, glucose was 87. Urination problem, less urination. Doesn't tell me a whole lot, Faisal. Sorry. Thank you, Doug C. What do you recommend? An insulin survey. That's the most first thing I'd have. Margaret D, regarding uric acid, have you followed Dr. Richard Johnson and David Perlmutter? I've seen a lot of Perlmutter stuff. They think uric acid elevation is connected to insulin resistance even before it causes gout. I do too, and I think it's an interesting point. And I'm not going to go into that detail today, but I do too. Thank you so much. Interesting comment, Margaret. And we are at the end of our comments, and I have to get ready for an appointment in 2 minutes. Thank you so much.